Welcome back to the Mind Behind Project Management. Today I want to talk about that kind of project day I think you know very well. Your calendar is full from the morning. You move from the team call to the stakeholder update, then into the risk meeting, and then you have a quick catch up, which is actually not that quick. Then you have another call because something from the first meeting still needs clarifying. So you've been working all day. You've been listening, answering questions, keeping people calm, making notes, spotting gaps, and just trying to move things forward. And then the last meeting ends and you realise the actual work is still waiting. So the plan that you need to update, the actions from before that need to be sent out, the decision that still needs to be noted, the risk that needs thinking through, and the people who've messaged you during the day still need a reply. And that's the part that can make you feel like you've been busy all day but somehow still fallen behind. This episode is about meeting overload, especially for project managers. Not because meetings are bad, because they're not. Some meetings solve a problem in 20 minutes that would take 3 days of back and forth messages. The issue is that when the whole day becomes just about meetings and the project managers expect to do the thinking and the organising and the follow-up work in the small gaps that are around them. I've had days where I finished the last call, looked at the time and thought, right, now I can start the work that came from the calls, but it's already 5 p.m. And this isn't about a time management problem. Sometimes the day was built in a way that just left you no space to think. And I think this is where people can be a bit hard on themselves. You tell yourself you should be more organised, take faster notes, be able to answer messages while you're listening, and you should have used that 10-minute gap you had much better. But a 10-minute gap is not always 10 minutes of usable thinking time, because you're closing one conversation, carrying the people, the decisions from it, then opening the next set of notes and trying to remember which version of the problem you're now discussing. And that switching has a cost. So there's a simple neuroscience bit to this. When you move from one meeting to another, your brain has to load to a different set of goals, people, risks, and context. It has to put one task down and then bring the other one to the front. And that uses attention and working memory. So even when no single meeting is, it might not be that difficult, the repeated switching can actually feel quite difficult and leave you feeling mentally full. You might notice that you read the same line twice, or maybe you forget why you open a document, or maybe you open the wrong document. We might have done that now and again where we're screen sharing and we may be screen sharing in our previous meeting, but then we open something from that and we quickly have to switch. Or you feel irritated by a small question and normally it would be fine. Maybe somebody asks what was agreed and your mind just goes blank for a second, even though you were in the meeting. And that doesn't mean you're not listening. It can mean your brain has been asked to reset all day without recovering in between. There's also an emotional side to meetings that doesn't appear in the calendar or in the agenda. And as a project manager, you're not only listening to words. You have to notice who's gone quiet, wondering whether the stakeholder you're speaking to really agrees, watching the reaction when a deadline is mentioned, deciding whether to challenge something now or follow up privately later, and you're trying to keep the tone calm when the room feels tense. And that is a lot of work in itself as well. You're reading the room, managing your own response, and also trying to make it easier for other people to say what needs to be said. And I talk about this quite a lot, where you have to make the space that you're in an honest, trusted space where people can say how they feel. And while that's a very important thing to do, it can be tiring, especially when you're doing it call after call. I think one of the mistakes we make is assuming that meeting overload looks like just someone saying, I have too many meetings, which is quite vague. And it's often just something that's really subtle compared to that. It can just look like someone who's usually quite prepared joining a meeting without having, reading the paper that comes with it. It can look like shorter answers. Maybe people who are normally quite quick to follow up are a bit slower, or someone just agrees very quickly because they don't have the headspace to work through the impact of that question. Maybe the team becomes a bit quieter as the week goes on and you don't have that much interaction. And I'm not saying you have to be speaking every day, but obviously communication is a big part, especially if you have deadlines and meetings coming up. You do need to discuss some of the actions and things. And none of those signs prove that someone is overloaded, because people have all sorts of things going on. But if the pattern changes, it's worth noticing before you decide that they're disengaged or difficult. So practically, a line that I would use, or I have used, is, just saying, oh, you've noticed you have a lot of calls this week. So is the meeting load making it harder to keep up with the follow-up work? And it's just a much more politer way of saying something like, why hasn't this been done yet? Because you already get people on the defensive. So it gives room for people to explain what's been happening without you trying to, I guess, poke at them or, like I said, get them on the defensive, and then they have this guard up and then they don't answer the question properly. So you can still talk about work. You're just starting from curiosity rather than a blame perspective. And that matters when people feel overloaded, because they often protect themselves by becoming quieter. That's why one of the most useful things as a project manager is to create better pauses inside the meeting and not just book more meetings around the problem. So instead of asking any concerns and just moving on, maybe, again, something practical to say is, before we agree on this, does anyone need a bit more time to think? I say this because I've been in meetings where we have spent 40 minutes discussing the background, and then we reach the end without actually being clear on what anybody was meant to decide. Now, it's not to say that discussion is not important, but the whole point of your meetings is to come with points that need to be actioned, decisions that need to be made, and also obviously who's going to take ownership. So if you're just spending that time of your meeting discussing what probably everybody already knows, that's not very productive. So before a meeting, I like to think that there are 3 things that I would like to check usually. Is there an update? Is there a decision? Or is this just a discussion? So if it's an update, could it just be written down and sent? And if it's a decision, then who actually needs to be there, and what's information that I could provide them or that they could be provided beforehand? And if it is a discussion, what are the questions we're trying to work through? And doing that one check can just remove a lot of meetings that exist, because when that happens, sometimes the purpose isn't clear. So we put in a meeting and we think, oh, this is what we're doing, but we haven't, maybe there's not much preparation. So people know why they're there and they know what they need to prepare. So for project managers, I think we also need to be honest about the work that happens after the meeting. So a 30-minute meeting is not always 30 minutes of work. There might be notes to write up, actions to confirm, you have to chase people, the plan needs updating, or you have to have a sort of side conversation with somebody because you maybe got a feeling they didn't want to raise it within the group. So when you look at your calendar, don't just count the meeting time, count meeting, recovery and follow-up time as real work. So for example, if you have 6 hours of calls and then 2 hours left in the day, because average is usually about an 8-hour day, well, a normal working day, then you don't have 2 free hours. You may already have more than 2 hours of work that's been created by these calls. And this is where I have to, I think it's important to get better at protecting space rather than hoping that that space appears, because it doesn't just appear by itself. So I think a good line to use, at some point would be, I can attend all those meetings, but, what is a priority? Because some of that follow-up work might go into tomorrow. So what are the high priorities here? So that sounds like you're being proactive, being self-aware, and you're not refusing to help. You're just trying to make sure that people see you're aware of what priorities need to be taken care of. And it's not to be precious about your calendar. It's just part of trying to do your job more efficiently. So meeting overload can affect how we respond emotionally. So when your attention is stretched, you may have less patience. A risk that's coming towards you might feel more of a personal thing. And a vague answer can just sometimes just feel a bit annoying. And you may react just quickly because you haven't had the headspace to settle down on your own response. So this is where emotional awareness matters. So before you reply, ask yourself, am I reacting to the person or reacting to the fact that I have no space to understand or process how I'm feeling emotionally because you haven't had that space all day? And I found that question useful because sometimes the message isn't the problem. It's just that it's arrived when your capacity is low. And that doesn't mean you ignore the issue. It just means give yourself space to pause and respond to the actual issue and not responding to the whole day that you've had of meetings. And the same applies when someone else sounds abrupt. So you don't have to accept poor behaviour, but you can just check what's the context behind before you make a judgment. So, maybe just say to someone, oh, you seem a little bit stretched today. Do you just want to take a moment and come back with this to the right people and we can set some time aside? Or, I don't think, there's sort of time in this certain room to make a decision. Let's confirm what we need and give people time to think. So that is protecting the quality of the decision, because, we all work hard and people get mentally tired. So making an agreement on dates or deferring a risk or adding another meeting, sometimes that creates relief in the moment but more work later. So I would try and say, before the meeting even starts, maybe right, by the end of this call we need to do etc, etc. So if you can't answer that question, then maybe the meeting shouldn't be scheduled at that point. Maybe you should push it back. So next time you decide to book a meeting, first ask what is still unclear and what basically the right people can be there to sort it out without bringing everybody back in. So you may still need the meeting, but at least it's got a purpose and a reason. And I also want to say something to anyone listening who actually feels guilty for not getting enough done after a meeting heavy day, because I have felt like that and I have sat with that guilt. Don't dismiss the attention and emotional effort that you had to put for those calls. Because remember, you were tracking information, people, decisions and risk, and that is work. Emotional work, mental load. And you also have to be honest if your current pattern of work is not sustainable. And the answer is to not quietly work later every evening so the calendar just, nothing, you don't have to move anything. I'm not saying that there might not be days where you have to work late, but I think it's important to have a work-life balance. So maybe shorten the call or just send the update instead, and then ask some people to get back to you instead in writing, and just say, I've got back-to-back meetings, but I'll come back to you, and give a time, give someone a deadline. Don't leave it vague. Just say, oh, I've got so and such going on. I've got meetings till 4, I can get back to you by 5, and that's fine. That's very professional. And it's better than answering really quickly just so you've messaged someone back and then you might miss something important. So the line that I would take into this week, and just as a summary, would be, before we add another meeting, what is still unclear? And remember the checklist I mentioned before about, is it a discussion, a decision, or an action? And if it's any of those, make sure you can answer that question properly. And knowing what the actual solution would be an actual better option than having silent stress. And that's it for today's episode of The Mind Behind Project Management. So remember, if you've ever finished a day of meetings and wondered why the actual work is still sitting there, I do hope this helped you feel understood, but also gave you a few things that you can do differently. You can spend all day talking about work and still have no time to do the work. A full calendar does not mean that the project is always moving. See you in the next episode.